This is the BBC. For details of our complete range of programmes, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
Welcome to the latest global news recorded at 13 hours GMT on Tuesday the 30th of May. I'm Jackie Leonard with a selection of highlights from across BBC World Service News today. Coming up, the former military leader of Panama, General Manuel Noriega, has died aged 83. We'll have an assessment.
Noriega was right at the juncture, if you will, between the Panamanian politics and military on the one hand, the Colombian drug cartels on the other, and the CIA on the other.
More than 25 people have been killed in 2 bomb explosions in the Iraqi capital, Baghdad. Mike Dubke, the White House communications director, has resigned after 3 months in the job. Also in the podcast, we'll hear from the doctor single-handedly looking after more than 400 patients in the Nuba Mountains of Sudan.
I just kind of steel myself, put my head down and charge ahead. You're tired, but you see one after another, and you before you know it, you're finished.
And how to convince people that reindeer aren't just for Christmas, but actually for eating. Alaskans are turning from hunting to farming just to survive.
Reindeer on this planet to feed people. And so I guess it's my job to take the magic out of Christmas.
We have to eat Rudolph.
Yes, we are going to eat rump of Rudolph.
But first, General Manuel Noriega, one of the most notorious dictators of Latin America, has died at the age of 83. He was a convicted murderer, money launderer, drug dealer and a double agent for the American intelligence agency and Fidel Castro's Cuba. But when he was no longer useful to the US, he was forcibly removed from power when American troops invaded the country in 1989. This is President George H.W. Bush announcing the military action.
Last Friday, Noriega declared his military dictatorship to be in a state of war with the United States and publicly threatened the lives of Americans in Panama. As president, I have no higher obligation than to safeguard the lives of American citizens. And that is why I directed our armed forces to protect the lives of American citizens in Panama and to bring General Noriega to justice in the United States.
General Noriega spent 17 years in jail in the US on drugs and money laundering charges. In 2010, he was extradited to France before returning to Panama to face trials for corruption, murder and human rights abuses. Christopher Dickey was the Central America correspondent for The Washington Post in the 1980s and got to know Noriega when he first came to power.
He used to work from a subterranean office in the National Guard headquarters. That was very bizarre to begin with. He had a collection of toy toads because sapo is a Panamanian slang for a government or police informer. And he also had lots of paintings of children on velvet with, big eyes and tears coming out of them. Very strange guy.
Our Latin America online editor Vanessa Buschluter told us more about General Noriega, first when he was an ally of the US.
For starters, he provided the CIA with information, starting as early as the 1950s, and continued to do so for decades. He also allowed the CIA to open listening posts in Panama. This at a time when left-wing Sandinista rebels were overthrowing the dictator Anastasio Somoza in Nicaragua, and FMLN guerrillas were fighting the government in El Salvador. So you can imagine how key this was to the CIA to have those listening posts in Central America to be able to listen in on what was happening there.
When he ceased to be useful, however, and America invaded Panama, tell us about how Noriega was captured.
Manuel Noriega took refuge in the Vatican's diplomatic mission in Panama City. That was on the 23rd of December of 1989. And on Christmas Day, the US Army decided to try and flush him out. So what did they do? They mounted loudspeakers onto the military vehicles parked outside the perimeter and blasted deafening pop and rock music at the embassy. And the National Security Archive at George Washington University actually has a list of everything that he had to endure. Some of the songs were clearly chosen for their value and irony, such as I Fought the Law by The Clash or All I Want Is You by U2. Others were just unbearably loud, so think Guns N' Roses and other heavy metal songs.
Now, he has died at the age of 83. What sort of reaction has there been in Panama?
One of the first to react was the current president of Panama, Juan Carlos Varela, who tweeted that the death of Noriega was the end of a chapter in that country's history. He also asked for the funeral to be allowed to go ahead peacefully for the sake of the family of Manuel Noriega. And I think that's how many Panamanians have seen it. In end to that part of its history. Panama is now a very different country. For example, one of the things that's changed is that it doesn't have an army anymore because they do not want to run the risk of such a coup d'etat and of a military strongman ever coming back to that country.
That was Vanessa Bushluter. 2 large bombs have gone off in the Iraqi capital Baghdad, killing more than 25 people. The first blast ripped through an ice cream parlour last night where families and children were breaking their fast together during the Muslim holy month of Ramadan. This morning there was a second explosion near one of the city's main bridges. Mohammed Yahya from the BBC Arabic service spoke to Rebecca Casby.
Well, it started at midnight Baghdad time in the predominantly Shia Al-Qarada district. The scene was a joyous Ramadan night where families were out to this ice cream parlor, as normal as it can be in Baghdad. And then all of a sudden there was a huge explosion. It's thought to be a suicide bomber, and there was scenes of carnage. Dozens of people were killed and injured. The latest casualty figures we have is 15 killed and 60 injured, but it could rise further. And then today, this morning, around 9 o'clock Baghdad time, there was another explosion in a busy area in central Baghdad between a bridge and a pensions office. And the casualty figure so far is 11 killed and 35 injured.
And we think that the first bomb, at least, was a car bomb, a suicide car bomb. Do we know any more details about what happened in the square?
Yes, the first explosion was a suicide car bomb. It was claimed by the Islamic State group. Today's explosion is thought to be a car bomb, and there has been so far no claim of responsibility, although it carries all the hallmarks of the so-called Islamic State.
And you mentioned this all happened in a mainly Shia area of Baghdad. It's not the first time they've been targeted.
Yes, Al-Qarada, which was targeted last night, was a scene of a very bad attack in the end of Ramadan last year as Iraqis were preparing for the festivities of Eid. And there was a huge suicide truck bomb that killed more than 200 people.
And as you mentioned, it is Ramadan at the moment, which is when families do get together in the evening and try and meet up with each other. What sort of impact will this have on people in Baghdad at this time? Because the security situation in Iraq does seem to have improved in the past year or so.
The difference between last year and this year is that this year IS is under a lot of pressure. Their presence in the city of Mosul has been reduced to a small pocket that is under increasing pressure. They have lost all of their major centers that they had in the Anbar region west of Baghdad. And the fear among Iraqis and Iraqi security officials is the more this group is being squeezed, the more they will try to infiltrate the capital with such attacks to cause carnage and distract the military from pressuring them even more.
That was Mohammed Yahya. The White House communications chief, Mike Dubke, has resigned after just 3 months in the job. Mr. Dubke, an experienced Republican strategist, was not part of Donald Trump's presidential campaign team and was hired to revamp the White House media strategy. Grant Ferrett has more.
There's been mounting speculation about possible changes to President Trump's media staff as the controversy over alleged links between his election campaign and Russia has deepened. Mike Dubke was something of an outsider among Mr. Trump's team, taking up his job as head of White House communications several weeks after the president's inauguration. According to one advisor, Kellyanne Conway, he made clear his desire to resign earlier this month, but offered to stay on until President Trump had completed his first overseas trip. Mr. Dubke is not a high-profile name, and it's thought further personnel changes may be planned.
That was Grant Ferrett. The Colombian government and the rebel group the FARC have agreed to extend the deadline for fighters to disarm by 20 days. Last year's peace agreement stipulated that all weapons had to be surrendered by today, May the 30th. But making weapons safe is only one of the outstanding issues from the civil war. Almost 40,000 people were kidnapped during the 5 decades of conflict. Many victims were held deep in the jungle, and Colombia's Radio Caracol has started trying to locate them. Candice Piet reports.
The Early Dawn programme, The Voice of the Kidnapped, on Colombia's Radio Caracol. The programme's director, Elvin Hoyos, was himself kidnapped in 1994. He was chained to a tree in the jungle with another prisoner. When released, he was convinced that a channel for the families of the victims was paramount.
Y yo le digo al guerrillero, mire, señor guerrillero, si usted está escuchando este programa.
I say to the guerrillas, look, gentlemen, if you are listening to this program and you are looking after a victim, lend him the radio. If that victim listens, he will march, not resist you. He'll eat what he's given. He won't argue with you.
Le decíamos, si llora, termínele el mensaje en positivo.
We tell the families, if you cry, end on a positive note. I cry because I love you, but don't worry, I'm just a big crybaby. But parallel to these messages, we had an investigation team trying to find out who the kidnappers were.
Seeing people, chained by the neck to a tree in the jungle means that for Colombians, the crime they most reject nowadays is kidnapping.
Kyle Johnson works for the Brussels-based International Crisis Group. He says for the families of victims, it's very hard to see the former FARC commanders in the media all the time.
There's a large section of kidnapping victims who are concerned that, first, the transitional justice mechanisms aren't good enough. FARC will get impunity, basically, is their concern. Second of all, you don't see any progress on them just because, the legislative, the technical, all those kind of aspects, they take time and they take money. And thirdly, you see the FARC in the media all the time, giving conferences, seeming very relaxed, like they already have a political life without having told the truth, without having given reparations to their victims, without having fulfilled all sorts of things you want them to fulfill.
For Ervin Hoyos, the director of Radio Caracol, there has been a personal price to pay. He now lives under armed guard, often abroad, because the FARC blamed him for the raid that released Betancourt and others. But he still believes there's a pressing reason to continue.
Han regresado más o menos 19,000, casi 20,000.
Almost 20,000 kidnapped victims have returned, but 4,000 haven't appeared. We don't know what happened. They were probably killed. We are working for these 4,000 until they show up, dead or alive.
That report was by our Latin America editor, Candice Piet. Resistance to antibiotics is one of the biggest crises facing modern medicine. Tens of thousands of people die every year because so many antibiotics can no longer fight off infection. Now, scientists in the United States have made a breakthrough. They've modified an existing medicine, vancomycin, making it about 1,000 times more powerful. Tom Fielden is our science editor.
Well, the researchers who are based at the Scripps Research Institute in California have been working to try and improve the toxicity or the potency of vancomycin, which is one of the antibiotics of last resort, really, that used to treat very complicated soft tissue and bone infections, and of course MRSA, hospital or community acquired infections. And it works by disrupting how the bacteria form their cell walls. And there are really two different mechanisms by which vancomycin does that. And that's made it a very effective antibiotic. It's been around for about 60 years, but inevitably resistance has started to creep in recently. And so what this team have done is they've tweaked that drug to try and give it a third mechanism of action, if you like, and that's what they think they've done very successfully.
And does that mean that this is the answer to the problem that we're facing about antibiotic resistance?
Well, that's what we're hearing this morning. We've been hearing terms like supercharged antibiotic, that it's a magical effect. I think that's probably a little bit overstated. It's a little bit too soon to call it all over now, that the battle is over, if you like. I mean, what they've done is in the lab, and it still takes 30 steps to introduce this new third avenue of attack. They're obviously going to have to refine that and get it down before it could be a usable drug. But I think the principle is what's really important here, because they've done this for vancomycin. If they can do it for other antibiotics, then you're going to get a whole new generation, a new lifetime span for all those antibiotics.
Do we have any idea about time scale? Because we are already in a situation where people are dying because of antibiotic resistance.
Absolutely. You know what scientists are like. They always say, in 5 years from now, we'll have got there. And that is, again, what they're saying about this. It is interesting because, obviously, vancomycin is a drug that does work. So you're not starting from scratch. You're not 10 or 20 or 30 years down the line from an effective treatment. So I think you could be more optimistic that by tweaking this drug, by adding another wing to its armoury, if you like, then you are much closer. So when they're saying 5 years from a drug, I think we can probably rely on that.
That was Tom Fielden. You're listening to Global News, the most important stories and the best interviews and on-the-spot reporting from the BBC World Service. And since you clearly know a good podcast when you hear one, let me gently usher you in the direction of Witness. It's all about history as told by the people who were there. First-hand accounts of important events which have helped to shape our lives. There are 5 of them a week. Today's podcast goes back to the summer of 1968, when a young sociologist from Bihar in India decided to devote his life to improving sanitation for the poorest and most oppressed communities in India. The clean and affordable toilet he designed went on to improve the lives of millions of people around the world. Rebecca Casby has been speaking to Dr. Bindeshwar Pathak, and if you're interested, search for Witness on your podcast app or go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts. A report by the United Nations documents human rights abuses on a massive scale in the Central African Republic. The report, which covers the period from 2003 to 2015, accuses government troops, local groups and members of international forces of violations. Imogen Folks in Geneva told us more about the findings.
Very, very disturbing reading. We've got years, over a decade of violence in which entire villages have been burnt to the ground as reprisal attacks, gang rapes of women and of girls as young as 5 years old, extrajudicial killings, detention and torture in detention so severe that the victims die, and all happening with complete impunity. All sides, both the security forces loyal to successive governments, armed militias from inside the Central African Republic and from neighbouring countries, and even in some cases international troops. All of these documented in this report. So far no one held accountable, and this is what the UN spokeswoman Ravina Shamdasani says has to change.
Justice cannot wait. It needs to be ongoing so that the people who are currently engaged in this armed conflict are aware that they are being watched and that the violations are being documented and that they are being attributed to the possible perpetrators with the view to bring them to justice.
So, Imogen, the UN says that the perpetrators will face justice. How will the UN do that?
Well, a special court has been created for the Central African Republic in 2015, in fact. And just in the last couple of weeks, a special prosecutor has been appointed. But it hasn't actually started to work yet. And there are 2 reasons for that. First of all, continued insecurity. Parts of the country are still in the hands of militias. And the country has very little judicial infrastructure, less than 200 magistrates. So the UN will need to put more resources into this, both in terms of staff and in terms of funding. In addition to which, there are thousands of victims. Not every case will come to court. That's another reason, as Ravina Shamdasani explained to us, that they should at least all be documented so that they're not forgotten.
We've been asked the question of, what's the point of documenting violations that took place between 2003 and 2015 when there are violations ongoing? Well, we cannot forget the victims of those crimes that were committed during that time. This is very important to the victims to have this recognition, to have the right to the truth about what happened to them and their family members.
And that issue of recognition, the UN points out, can also be given or allowed to the victims of some of these human rights violations by establishing a truth and reconciliation process, so that even if a severe violation doesn't actually come to court, even if the perpetrator is long gone and can never be punished, then at least in an open forum, in a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the victims will be allowed to say what happened to them, and people will actually listen to them. The UN says this is very, very important in terms of moving towards a peace process in a country which has suffered as much as the Central African Republic.
Imogen Folks. There are just 9 days to go now before the people of Britain head to the polls in a general election. On Monday, television viewers tuned in to a live debate. The Prime Minister, Theresa May, for the Conservative Party, and her rival from the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, faced questions from an audience and a political journalist, but they didn't actually face each other directly. Mr Corbyn was first up. He set out his vision of what could be a good deal with the EU post-Brexit.
What they will see is a government that is going to protect the protocols, environmental conditions, workers' rights that we achieved through Europe, and a government that wants a serious relationship with Europe, but respects the result of our referendum in that we're leaving the European Union.
You are prepared to contemplate, then, no deal?
There's going to be a deal.
There is going to be a deal. Would you leave Europe without a deal?
We will make sure there's a deal.
When Theresa May's turn came, she faced a series of questions over her apparent changes of heart on Brexit, but she insisted that on Brexit negotiations she'd be tough.
We will be there to negotiate the right deal, but what I have said is no deal is better than a bad deal. We have to be prepared to walk out.
So you are prepared to walk away from the European Union with no deal?
No deal is better than a bad deal.
But as our London correspondent Rob Watson explained to Rebecca Casby, it seemed that neither candidate had offered any details of how they would really handle the Brexit talks.
I mean, it is quite extraordinary that neither of Britain's two main party leaders have been able or willing to articulate much of a vision for what a post-EU Britain will look like, given that it's the biggest challenge facing the UK since we joined over 40 years ago. I mean, you got a flavour of it there. Mrs May has tended to make the argument about the process of negotiating with the EU. She says it's either me or, as the Conservatives portray him, the bumbling old lefty leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn. And for his part, Mr Corbyn has sought to make this election far more about opposition to continuing austerity and the classic populist message of the left that the rich and big business should be paying more taxes to fund better public services. So are we much further along in knowing what post-Brexit Britain looks like? Absolutely not.
Well, the other extraordinary thing, Rob, about all of this is, of course, a couple of weeks ago, analysts were anticipating a landslide for Mrs May for the Conservatives, and even the Labour leadership supporters, Mr Corbyn's own supporters, were talking about the likely prospect of losing and how they would handle that. But now Mrs May's numbers in the polls are coming down, aren't they, on a daily basis, it seems?
Absolutely. Mrs May very much wanted to make this election, Rebecca, about her leadership. And on the day she called it, the Conservatives had, and listen for this, a whopping 24% lead over Labour in the polls. Now that is more than halved. And I think making it about her as a person has turned out to be a risk. And I think the answer to your question, why is that happening? It's basically that her campaign has been less than stellar, and that, if anything, the focus on her has highlighted her considerable limitations as a politician. I mean, she's quite a stiff communicator. She doesn't seem very nimble in dealing with questions on her feet. And obviously her U-turns over calling a snap election in the first place have somewhat undermined her slogan of being the strong and stable leader.
That was Rob Watson. One of China's most famous table tennis stars has been suspended from his role as coach of the women's national team. Our Asia-Pacific editor Michael Bristow explained why.
It's all over an alleged gambling debt. In essence, Kong Ling Hui went to Singapore a couple of years ago. He admits that quite freely, and he went to a casino in which he says he just stood by and watched his friends and relatives play. He does admit, though, that he helped them get some gambling chips and left some of his own personal information. And anyway, these people appear to have gambled away. A debt was incurred. The Singapore casino says he's responsible. It's now filed a legal case. It wants the money back. Kong Ling Hui has been suspended as coach. He's been sent home from Germany, where the World Championships are taking place at the moment, and there's going to be an investigation into his conduct.
That was Michael Bristow. In the Arctic, global warming is making traditional hunting harder for indigenous communities as caribou, salmon and even polar bears become more scarce. And so some native Alaskans are turning from hunting to farming to survive, in particular to farming reindeer. There are even plans to fly hundreds of the animals across the vast state to get small farms started. Our North America correspondent James Cook has been to Alaska to find out more.
This snuffling noise is Roger the reindeer, investigating the microphone to see whether it's worth a nibble. With his big eyes and friendly demeanour, Roger is pretty cute. He may be pretty tasty too.
The fat is deposited on the outside of the reindeer and not marbled within the meat, so the meat is very lean.
Anne and Bruce Davis are reindeer farmers near Nome in the far west of Alaska, and they know all sorts of recipes.
Eskimo ice cream.
It's very high in carbs and fat, and so it's a good source of energy.
I never heard of Eskimo ice cream.
It's nothing like American ice cream, so you have to totally separate yourself from that.
Put that picture out of your mind. It's something different. Yeah, it's in berries, fat, seal oil, and water, and you mix it, and it becomes very fluffy.
You load up the fat base with lots and lots of berries, different kinds of berries, and it's pretty good to eat too.
Reindeer are actually quite a new arrival in Alaska. They were introduced to a peninsula near Russia at the end of the 19th century and didn't spread far. But Greg Finstad wants to change that by flying them to the interior.
We have millions of hectares of the most productive rangeland in the world.
Mr. Finstad, who runs the reindeer research program at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, says a shift from hunting to farming makes sense, especially for struggling rural communities on the Yukon River.
These people are not able to subsist anymore, and they're off the road system. They have to ship in very expensive food, and it doesn't work. They're very worried about starving, and it's a legitimate concern.
And so one such community, Stevens Village in central Alaska, has bought a farm to raise up to 2,000 reindeer. They'll be loaded into a DC-6 transport plane on the west coast and flown to the interior to start the new farm.
Reindeer travel very well. We can stick them in the plane, move them up to first class, then we can move the cattle back into cattle class, and off we go.
Before reindeer consumption becomes widespread, though, there is a problem. Reindeer have rather good PR, as Greg Finstad admits.
We do have a bit of a problem with marketing reindeer meat, and it's the perception that reindeer on this planet, to pull a sled that with this chubby guy in a red suit and a white beard, that reindeer on this planet to haul Santa Claus around in presents. But that's actually not true. Reindeer on this planet to feed people. And so I guess it's my job to take the magic out of Christmas.
We have to eat Rudolph.
Yes, we are going to eat rump of Rudolph, and I've gotten myself in a lot of trouble, so I try not to say that anymore.
Greg Finstad, and he was speaking to James Cook. And no reindeer were injured in the making of that report. And finally, a surgeon working in a war-affected area of Sudan has won a $1 million award for humanitarian work. Dr. Tom Catena is the only doctor based in the Nuba Mountains, where he's lived since 2007. He's won the Aurora Prize for Awakening Humanity. The BBC's Michelle Hussein asked him to describe his working day.
Well, an average day starts around 5:30 when I get up, and my day starts with going to Mass. I'm there as a Catholic missionary, so I start the day with Mass at about 6 o'clock in the morning. 7:30, head to the hospital and start the ward rounds. Right now I'm just seeing the surgical patients in the children's ward, maternity ward, female ward, male ward, TB leprosy ward. So generally you see all the patients on those wards. And that can be upwards of 400 patients, depending on the time of the year. Generally, after the ward rounds, I go to the outpatient clinic, and we'll see an additional, say, 50 outpatients there. Nighttime, do all the administrative work, answering emails and other things that deal with administration. Then I'm on call at night. So any maternity case or emergency that comes in, I'm on call until the following morning when I start the process again.
So you have sole responsibility for hundreds of people in the hospital and the outpatients and the emergency cases. How do you cope?
You just realize that there's no one else that can do that job that day. And for the sake of the patients and the work there, I just kind of steel myself, put my head down and charge ahead. You're tired, but you see one after another, and you, before you know it, you're finished.
And you've lived in this region, in this part of Sudan, the Nuba Mountains, since 2007. What should we know about that part of the world?
Well, Nuba Mountains, the Nuba people have been really oppressed for centuries. We're in a state of civil war again. There's been civil war there since June 2011. The war is still active, although there's somewhat of a ceasefire. We have 2 unilateral ceasefires between the 2 warring parties. Right now, we're facing very, very severe food shortages, and that's as a combination of poor harvest last year, but more significantly due to the war, because the Sudan army has encroached upon the best farmland in Nuba Mountains, so people were not able to cultivate their usual farms.
Now that you've won this international award and that there's a significant amount of money that comes with it, mostly to donate to a cause, but also some money for yourself, is it life-changing for you personally and for what you are able to do with it?
One of the great things about this prize is that it gives money to the winner that is then given out to other organizations that do similar type work. So it propagates the work you're doing. And, I hope to use this to highlight the plight of the people of the Nuba Mountains and also to help to improve the healthcare situation in Nuba, which is very, very limited.
Dr. Tom Catena, the 2017 winner of the Aurora Prize. And that's it from us for now. But Alex Ritson will have an updated version of the Global News podcast for you later. If you'd like to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, do please send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Jackie Leonard, and until next time, goodbye.